To Save a Hobbit by a Random Plot Bunny. Chapter 10. Awake again, I see, were the first words Bilbo heard as he opened his eyes and found that he hadn't been dreaming after all. He really hadn't been eaten by Smaug. Yes, I'm awake, he agreed wearily as he stood up. If he wasn't to be eaten, then he would conduct this conversation with all good manners intact, like a proper Baggins should. Giving a bow, he addressed the fire-breathing drake before him. Bilbo Baggins, at your service. It took only a moment for the small man to realize that the rumbling he felt in the air was the dragon's silent laughter. Smaug, the last of the great dragons, and yours. The immense reptile then dipped his neck in a semblance of a bow and gave another air-rattling and silent chuckle. And now that formal introductions are over with, you will answer my questions. How did you get here, and why? Bilbo thought over how best to answer those questions for a moment before lowering himself back to the floor of gold and making himself as comfortable as possible on the hard surface. This story would take a while to tell, and he wanted to be as comfortable as possible while telling it, or as comfortable as possible when one was telling a tale to a fire-breathing dragon. Well, you see, it all started in a hole in the ground. Bifur had never been one to sit back and wait for things to happen, especially not when a friend was in danger, and Bilbo was most definitely a friend. The first one he had made since his injury, the first one to treat him as a real person instead of an oddity to be pitied. And so was having to forcibly resist the urge to storm through the partly open doorway and drag Bilbo back up to safety. It was a losing battle, and he knew it. Bofur and Bombra on either side of him knew it too, but they both silently agreed with him, and so wouldn't be putting up a fuss when following him in when he finally broke down and ran after their hobbit. He occupied his time and distracted himself as best as he could by sharpening his blades and watching his king pace. As the eastern sky began to lighten, he grew even more restless, and so when Thorin began heading for the once secret entrance, he was up and following with his cousins at his back even before the order to do so was given. Ori was nervous and afraid, and was knitting like mad to try and hide it. The casual onlooker might think that he feared for the safety of his brothers if they had to face the dragon, or they might believe that he was nervous about what the future might hold for them all if said dragon were to awaken. The casual onlooker would be wrong. The young scribe was afraid for his small friend that had barely set out into the darkness of the mountain to see if the resident dragon still lived, and to try and steal the king's stone, if he could find it. The young dwarf was nervous about how long his friend had been gone already. It had been hours. Looking up when he ran out of yarn, something he had never done before, he saw that the simple scarf he had been trying to make for Bilbo was now longer than Dwalin was tall. Putting it aside, he picked up his sword that Nori had gotten for him just as the leader began heading for the door. He was going to go and find his friend, and he didn't care what anyone else thought on the subject. He would never let their hobbit out of his sight again after this. Balin watched in amusement as every dwarf dealt with their anxiety over their burglar in their own way, and was honest enough with himself to know that doing so was his own coping method. He also found it amusing, in an abstract sort of way, that now that they were resting on the very doorstep of their long-anticipated destination, that not a one of them was giving a thought to the kingdom that they might regain by the end of the day. Instead, they were all worrying over one little man, a hobbit, their friend. He also knew that he was no better than the rest on this score, and was content with that fact. Noticing that Thorin's continuous pacing seemed to have changed to a more decisive stride, Balin picked up his weapon of choice and began following his king with one thought in his mind. Finally! I thought we would never start after our hobbit. It was nearing dawn, and Thorin was a wreck. Ever since they had let Bilbo go down in that dark corridor, he'd been pacing, and not even his nephews had been bold enough to approach him. His mind was awash in a sea of questions that he had no answers for. Was Bilbo all right? Had he found the stone? Had he run afoul of the dragon? Had he gotten lost in the vast corridors? Was he all right? His resolve to wait broke with the sunrise. All right, let's go, he called over his shoulder as he made his way to the entrance, not waiting for anyone to acknowledge his order and not giving them a chance to argue it either. Thorin hefted his pack, and Bilbo's as well, further up on his shoulder and headed down to find his burglar with the company close on his heels. And so he, the dumb one, had just killed his two companions and is so terrified of being infected that he takes my advice on how to prevent himself becoming so. And what did you tell him? Smaug asked, now completely absorbed in the tale. Absorbed to the point that he didn't even look up when he heard the dwarves come to a stop a short distance from where he lived with Bilbo in the Gold. I told him to go bathe in a mountain stream to prevent him from contracting the contagion, and then pointed him in the right direction. Of course. Bilbo paused for effect there, and didn't have long to wait before he got the response he was waiting for. Of course you did. And then? Smaug asked eagerly, causing the Hobbit to smile. It was so nice sitting here telling his story that it was easy for him to forget that his eager audience was in truth a danger to him and his friends. And then he climbed up the rock outcropping I had pointed him to and into the dawnlight, where he instantly turned to stone. Smaug threw his head back and let out a laugh so hearty that several of the stunned and watching company were forced to smile along with him. Bilbo simply looked pleased that his story had been well received, even with the gold under him shifting and shaking with the force of the dragon's mirth. As silence descended over the gold-filled hall, Thorin lifted his sword in a defensive position and yelled his demand at the unsurprised dragon. Release the Hobbit, you foul beast! While Bilbo's shocked face at the sudden appearance of his friends was expected, Smaug's reaction was not. Curling himself more protectively around the small man, Smaug glared fiercely at the company, and then ignored them. So then what happened? The dragon asked, dragging Bilbo's attention back to himself and away from the dwarves that were all staring at him in shock. As Bilbo shook off his own shock and began the next bit of his story, as a half-whispered conversation / argument started up amongst the watching group. It was Dwalin who finally summed up their feelings and brought an end to the ever-circling arguments. He's done it again. Our burglar has done it again.